made our decision to show the Father's love with great power from above. We are united in Jesus Christ. We are the soldiers of the light. We don't wrestle flesh and blood, but principalities of the dark. We too are marching to one beat, rushing the enemy under our feet. We are mighty in our stand, with God's word in our hand. Let us reach this generation, every tribe and every nation, for we've overcome the world by the blood of Christ the Lamb. We are united in Jesus Christ. We are the soldiers of the light. We don't wrestle flesh and blood, but principalities of the dark. We too are marching to one beat, crushing the enemy under our feet. We are mighty in our stand, with God's word in our hand. Lord our God is a sword and shield. Lord our God is a sword and shield. Lord our God is a sword and shield. Lord our God is a sword and power. Lord our God is a sword and shield. The rock of We are united in Jesus Christ. We are the soldiers of the light. We don't wrestle flesh and blood, but principalities of the dark. We too are marching to one beat, crushing the enemy under our feet. We are mighty in our stand, with God's word in our hand. Lord our God is a sword and shield. The Lord our God is a sword and shield. Lord our God is a sword and shield. Lord our God is a mighty tower. Lord our God is a sword and shield. The rock of We are united in Jesus Christ. We are the soldiers of the light. We don't wrestle flesh and blood, but principalities of the dark. We too are marching to one beat, crushing the enemy under our feet. We are mighty in our stand, with God's word in our hand. We too are marching to one beat, crushing the enemy under our feet. We are mighty in our stand, with God's word in our hand. We are mighty in our stand, with God's word in our hand. We are mighty in our stand, with God's word in our hand. We are mighty.
Good morning. Am I on? Good morning. Okay, I just want to make sure this is working. So welcome. Welcome to everyone here. Welcome everyone who's listening online and future streamers. Don gave me about 10 other things to remember on top of the talk. So there's going to be a bulletin that's going to go around and a sign-in sheet, so please sign in when it comes around. And glad you're all here. Wow, I can't believe it. Summer has gone really, really quickly, although we have a little bit of summer, so I don't want to wish the rest of it away. But we're back, and in this room, it's great to be here. I got to say a couple of things. One, when Don was sharing that, when we were going to move from the Commons to someplace else, and he was talking about it, and he said, "Oh, we might be moving to the music room." And I remember, 3-4 years ago when we were teaching back here, the room was much different than what it is right now. And I was really sort of skeptical. I said, are you sure we want to do it in the music room? I'm not sure it's going to work. He's like, and Don's like, no, I got this vision, I got this plan, we're going to, whatever he thinks about that I would never think about in a million years. But lo and behold, in a matter of 3 months' time, he's turned this place into what it is right now. The only one that could have pulled this off in 3 months' time or any length of time is Don. So just a reminder to the church about how blessed we are to have him as a member. So thank you. What did he? What, it was only $20 that you gave me, was it? It could be bought for much cheaper. So then the other thing that I want to do, I'm going to build a little bit upon what Don had talked about last week, and then we're going to get into words of affirmation. And like most times, that when Don speaks, he provides really good pieces of advice. I mean, lots of good insights, lots of good advice. But every once in a while, Don will give what I consider to be life-changing advice. Last week was one of those moments. I don't know if you guys picked up on it, but you miss a little, you miss a lot, and I want to make sure that you don't miss this one. But he was quoting a clinical psychologist, I think, and it was targeted towards men whose love language is physical touch. And I think it was something to the effect of, guys, if you want more intimacy with your wife, just do the dishes. I know that's life-changing advice. I'm going to tell you, that's not a small thing, but I got to tell you, I turned around, every guy in the room grabbed their bulletin and was taking a note. Just do the dishes. Heck, that's it. That's all I got to do. So, if we want to start with some Q&A, we could do that. Did you scrub? Did anybody dry the dishes? Well, you could save the Q&A for later. But life-changing advice. So, I don't know that I'm going to have life-changing advice, but first of all, let's start with sort of the whole notion of the 5 love languages. When we went, I think this book came out, in 2006, and when we were at the old church, we did a study there of the 5 love languages, and what I remember was that, this was it was sort of a turnaround book. It was very popular. And I went out to dinner with 2 friends that I'd been friends with for many years. All 3 of us, we knew each other really well. And what my 2 friends started to do is sort of typically what a lot of people do with this book is everyone wants to guess what each other's love language is. And they were doing this. They were doing this for 10, 15 minutes, right? Your quality time. No, I think your acts of service. No, maybe physical touch, gifts, whatever. They're doing this 10, 15 minutes. And then eventually I said, okay, enough. Now it's your guys' turn to guess what mine is. And no sooner did I get those words out of my mouth, they were like, words of affirmation. I'm like, do you guys want to take a second to think about this? You just spent the last 10, 15 minutes. Say, no, your words of affirmation. There's no doubt your words of affirmation. I said, great, I'm words of affirmation. Can you say something nice to me now? So I am definitively, unequivocally, words of affirmation. It's second to none. Having said that, what we had talked about last week is that we not only have primary love languages, but we have secondary ones. And I think my close second would probably fit into the category of quality time. But that's only if you're saying something nice to me. So that's when it's the really good quality time. Now, the one thing I would say that I'm definitively not of the 5 love languages is physical touch. Now, of course, that doesn't apply to the spouse or the kids or whatever. But in general, I don't like the touching thing, right? The handshake thing, the hugging thing, a little bit more uncomfortable. The hugging thing, where they want to try and give you a kiss on the cheek, way more uncomfortable, right? Now this is getting super uncomfortable. The thing that, then you've got your back slappers, right? And you know who you are, right? Right? It's the, hello, Dave. I don't like the back slapping. I'm like, oh, hello. But then, even worse, you've got the blindsided back slapper, right? This back slap that you don't even see coming, right? And then they hit you in the back, and it's like my brains want to explode through my head. And that happened one time, and then I was so startled that I turned around and I just gave the hardest slap I could give on that person's back. They're like, what was that? I said, I'm sorry, I thought your love language was physical touch. Right? So if you want to love me, say something nice, but keep your hands off me. So that's the punchline. So there is a talk in this. So one of the things, again, so I want to build upon what Don had talked about last week first, And that's just sort of an overview of the book. And so I've narrowed the overview down to 4 observations that I made, like throughout this. And they tie together, and it really creates a foundation for the specific love languages that we're going to talk about here the next 5 weeks. Yeah, because there's 5 love languages. But the first, observation that I made, and to me this is like one of the most important and fundamental observations in the whole book. I mean, to me this sort of sets the stage for really understanding the 5 love languages. And that's just simply the difference between infatuation and love, right? So in talking about infatuation is just really sort of a natural, physical sort of feeling that we have for someone else. Probably most marriages, most relationships started with the whole notion of infatuation. And this is no different. But the thing to understand about infatuation, it's truly an involuntary sort of response. It requires no give by either side to have a notion of infatuation. And that's not a good thing or a bad thing, it just is, right? I mean, it's just very real. And we know about the whole notion about infatuation, which the book, or Gary Chapman, the writer of the book, talks about. That's sort of the falling in love stage of a relationship. And the thing about the whole notion of infatuation is that we sort of get this high from this infatuation, that it sort of clouds our thinking, and that's all we want to do is sort of spend time with that person, and we sort of ignore all the things about that person because we're so intoxicated by the infatuation. The thing that's sort of noted in the book that's really important to know is that infatuation is not a permanent thing. And in fact, in most cases over a 2-year period of time, infatuation wears off for most, if not all of us. So I'll hold that thought for a second as we move to the notion of love and where the difference lies. Well, infatuation, as I said, is a very involuntary thing. It requires no give or take in return, whereas love is almost the complete opposite. Love is really, defined by giving of oneself to another, and particularly giving of oneself and knowingly giving something that's pleasing to the person that you're giving it to, and doing that without any expectation of receiving anything in return, right? So it's a lot to unpack, but I want to repeat it because it's really important. It's a voluntary act where you're giving something very pleasing, knowingly pleasing to the other person without expectation of getting anything in return. So the contrast, right? So very different than infatuation. Why is that important? For love, you create sort of this emotional attachment that has a lot of stickiness to this. And if you do it and you do it repeatedly, it's what builds the strong bond with your spouse. Now everything I'm talking about today is about, like, I'm going to reference to the spouse. Now, the 5 love languages, as we know, could apply really to most any relationship, but everything that I'm going to be talking about is relative to the spouse. So by building that and doing that over and over and over again, it builds a very sticky relationship, and you can't stop doing it. Now, why is this important relative to the notion of infatuation? Well, infatuation, given the fact that it's involuntary and that it wears off, during that period of time, you're making some big decisions about your life while you're in the period of infatuation. Primarily, oh wow, I'm falling in love. This is I've known this person for 6 weeks. I want to marry this person and be with this person for the rest of my life. But if that's done without any sort of foundation with love, you find out very quickly that the realities of life come into play once that infatuation wears off. And if you haven't built any sort of emotional attachment by actually experiencing and developing true love, marriages break down very, very quickly. And the interesting statistic from the book is that 40% of first marriages end in divorce, 60% of second marriages end in divorce, and 75% of third marriages end in divorce. And it's just very striking that a lot of the reason for the breakdown in marriages is the lack of understanding about what love really is and what it is not. And as a result, like this infatuation, this high that you get from the infatuation, when it wears off, it's like, well, maybe I wasn't in love with this person, And the fact of the matter is that in that you're sort of in search for that high, so that these marriages break down as you're in search for that high, but they'll continually break down if in fact you're not building love. The other thing to note about the whole love piece is that it takes work, right? Nothing in life that's good or that's real comes easy. And by no means does love come easy, by no means does marriage come easy. Marriage is very difficult, it takes a lot of work, it takes constant work, it takes consistent work. You can't stop doing it. It's not like the person who ran a marathon when they're in their 20s and said, boy, I've run this marathon, I don't have to ever exercise again. Well, you stop exercising your body, your mind, it breaks down. You stop exercising your marriage, it breaks down. The other thing to know too about the 5 love languages is that, that people might misconstrue that, oh yeah, this is just for people who have issues or problems with their marriages. And I would say that's exactly right? It's exactly for those people because, in fact, everybody has issues. Nobody has the perfect marriage. In fact, if you think that you've got a perfect marriage, you're probably watching too much, what is the Hallmark movies? Does anybody watch those? Right? I mean, it just could sort of, mess with your mind to think like, oh wow, there's this thing of perfection that doesn't really exist, and because it's less than perfect, you misconstrue that things aren't, going well, where in fact, it just takes a lot of work, and you can't stop working it. So the second piece, observation, sort of following along that line, is that if in fact love comes from giving something that's knowingly pleasing to your spouse, how do you find that out? How do you might think that you know, but how do I really know what's truly pleasing to my spouse? So rather than kind of sort of this massive search about like, hey, how do I figure this out? That's where Gary Chapman's book comes in, The 5 Love Languages, is that he's tried to narrow that search down into 5 distinct love languages, of which, his premise, and it's a very good premise, is that we all fit into one of these love languages. And if you understand what that love language is, i.e. the spouse who is trying to give love, you narrow the search and you could have a much greater probability in terms of providing something that's pleasing to your spouse, assuming that you're doing this without any expectation in return. And thus the notion of the 5 love languages. The other thing about that in terms of the search is that, when you think about, sort of the job of the spouse to give love to the other, it's no different than companies who are marketing. I mean, we're marketed to all the time, and companies' success in terms of selling their products is not only understanding their products, but really understanding who they're selling to, and making sure that they're finding products that are pleasing to others such that people buy their products and they can make, as much money as they possibly can from this. And it's not about whether the owners of the company, whether what they're selling is pleasing to them, right? I mean, i.e., your job as a spouse is not to give your love language to the other because it may not be relevant, but it's to find the love language of the other. So we're marketers as spouses to find that love language of our spouse and give as much of it unselfishly as we can. The third observation sort of tying into this is that the how, right? So now that we know that, like how do we specifically find what that love language is, and how do we know what's specifically pleasing? What tactics do we take? And Gary Chapman is really big on sort of the list thing, but I would say even before that, it's as simple as communication, right? Effective relationships come with good communication, very honest, candid, constructive communication. You need all of those adjectives, honest, constructive, and whatnot. But you simply have to communicate. You got to be honest with each other in terms of what's pleasing, what's not pleasing. Like I said, Chapman is a big list guy. You want to write down a list of things that you believe are pleasing to the other and share those lists and share those thoughts. I mean, whether it's in list form or whether it's verbally or whatnot, whatever the tactic is. I know that last week we did, there's quizzes in the book where you figure out what your love language is and then you want to figure out what your spouse's love language is. But a good exchange of like what your love language is to each other and see how that matches up with what you thought your spouse's love language. It's probably a good tactic in terms of, finding that out. But that's a routine that you could go to. But in any case, though, more than any of the list stuff or whatever, you need to be observant. I mean, if you really want a strong bond, you need to be very observant in terms of what clicks with your spouse versus what doesn't click with the spouse, and as much as possible try and avoid one versus the other. And then the last thing, observation, the fourth observation, again, sort of tying to this, is that, what if my spouse doesn't want to play along in this game of finding each other's love language? And that's a very real thing, right? I mean, it's uncomfortable for a lot of people to sort of talk honestly and constructively and do this, or your spouse might be like, oh, we don't need to do this, our relationship is fine, or we don't need to do this, this is, kind of stupid, or whatever it might be. And that case might exist, but again, going back to the definition of love language, of love itself, it's like knowingly giving something that's pleasing to your spouse without expectation of getting anything in return. When you fall into this situation, the key is that you want to, again, through observation, through understanding, create sort of your own mental list of what's pleasing, knowingly pleasing to your spouse, and do it without any expectation of getting anything in return, despite the fact that your other spouse apparently doesn't want to play along. And the key to that is that if you do this and you do this unselfishly and do it consistently, eventually, likely, it will be reciprocated in some fashion. So now, sort of shifting over, so those are sort of the observations that I think are really sort of foundational to any of the specific love languages that we're going to be talking about. And now I want to get into a little bit about the words of affirmation. And with the words of affirmation, like one of the things, I want you to note is that, like what I'm going to be talking about now, and really what our next four speakers are going to be talking about relative to their specific love language, this is not about sort of figuring out your love language, right? Not that that's unimportant and not relevant, but this is about now thinking about, okay, if I have a spouse whose love language is words of affirmation, what is it that I need to do in order to satisfy that love language, right? So think about it, in that context. So this is, sometimes like, we're, for Mid-Pointe, and we talk a lot about, hey, making sure that we're not talking over people's heads and whatever. So this is a relatively sort of complicated concept, so please bear with me. But in order to be effective in terms of giving to someone whose love language is words of affirmation, you need to do this. Just say something nice. Like this ultra complicated thing. I mean, you kind of read over his book, I read over his chapter, and it's like, it's just basically, in essence, just say something nice. And I could say that over and over for 50 minutes to fill 50 minutes, but I think that would be a bit redundant. But it's as simple as that. I mean, in Proverbs, 12:25, it says, an anxious heart weighs a man down, but a kind word cheers him up. I agree. I agree with that one. Proverbs 18:21, the tongue has the power of life and death. Right? What you say has a bearing on what the other person feels. And it could build you up real quickly, and it could knock you down just as quickly. So the saying something nice is just very real. I mean, it's as simple as that. Now, here's sort of the thing. So, I mean, of the 5 love languages, in my opinion, if your spouse's love language is words of affirmation, I think you're kind of lucky, because it's the easiest of the 5 love languages to fulfill. Right? Acts of service, takes time and effort, quality time, you got to give of yourself, you got to give time. Gifts, you got to figure out what gift they want, what they like, you got to wrap it, you got to make sure you got the gift receipt if they don't like it, and you got to just keep your fingers and toes crossed that it works. And then physical touch. Well, you guys could use your imagination on that one. These all take time, time and effort. More time and effort than just saying something nice, just words of affirmation. So if in fact words of affirmation is the easiest of the 5 love languages, why is it sometimes difficult for spouses to give on that one, right? I mean, so, and that was sort of what came to my mind, is like, what are the inhibitors sort of standing in the way of what is apparently the easiest love language to give to your spouse? What's getting in the way of that? So I came up with a few, and to start with is the whole notion of, well, I'm not giving that to my spouse because I'm not getting in return. My love language is not being filled, so therefore I'm not going to give in return. Sort of thinking about this as, and going back, like the whole notion of love is not a quid pro quo, right? I mean, it's not a you scratch my back, I scratch yours. That's not love. But it's so easy to sort of fall into that, because when your needs aren't being met, it's super, super difficult to give of oneself unselfishly. Very, very, very difficult. Chapman had a really good example in the book where he talked about this couple that he was counseling to that was having challenges in their marriage. And he first interviewed the wife, we'll call them Jane and Joe for that matter. He interviewed Jane, and Jane expressed the fact that, oh wow, my love language, she didn't even know about love languages. What she expressed was the fact that, oh yeah, my spouse Joe, I keep asking him to paint the room, paint the bedroom. And I've asked him multiple times, and I've asked him multiple times, and I've asked him multiple times, and he just won't do it. So then Chapman asked, Jane a couple of questions. Well, does Joe do anything that's, that you like, that you appreciate, or that you think is worthy of something that's comfortable to you? So she read off a list of different things that he does, like he, does grocery shopping, he mows the lawn, he pays the bills, he's got a good job, or whatever the list was. It was a relatively long list. So then Chapman said to Jane, he said, okay, I want you to do something for me. Don't ask him again to paint the bedroom. Stop asking him. And she looks sort of puzzled. He goes, what I want you to do is, like, these things that you think that he's doing well, have a list and make it a point to tell him how much you appreciate these things that he's doing. Not all at once, but do it periodically and do it consistently. On the flip side, he had an interview with Joe, and Joe's issues were pretty much that she doesn't appreciate anything that I do. And as a result, it just frustrates me, and it kind of keeps me from wanting to do anything for her. So as Chapman sort of gave somewhat similar advice, they went away, and after a couple of months' time, Jane calls Chapman back and says, wow, this worked. My room's painted, right? Talks to Joe, and Joe's like, oh man, I've never been happier. I mean, she really does appreciate these things that I do. So point being, again, like if you're sort of waiting for the other person to reciprocate, right, and do something for you before you do something to them, that doesn't fit within the whole notion of really building a strong, loving relationship. But having said that, if in fact you exercise the other person's love language, you're likely going to get reciprocated in terms of having your needs met. The other inhibitor that I came up with, or that came to my mind, is that there's a lack of empathy as the love language that you're trying to meet for your spouse, the love language that you're trying to speak for your spouse, isn't your language. You don't speak that language, right? I mean, it's not something that comes naturally to you because that's not your love language. And that's very difficult, right? Because it's like, oh wow, I really got to say something nice. That's kind of petty, right? I mean, what's the big deal, right? Well, it is a big deal, right? But if your love language isn't that and you don't speak it, it's easy to sort of miss the fact that what's not important to you is hugely important to the other, right? So one of the examples, I'll use a personal example, but I still remember was about 35 years ago, our first Mother's Day. So put your calculators away, don't start trying to figure out my age, right? So I'm young, right? But I remember, I did sort of the foolish thing of saying, to my wife Tarna, I said, oh, do you want anything for Mother's Day? Right? I was young. I was a young guy, right? I mean, a foolish question. It's like, no, you don't need to get me anything, right? The old, you don't need to get me anything. And I fell for it, right? Because gifts aren't my thing. I'm like, okay. Well, lo and behold, Mother's Day came. What did you get me? Well, you said I didn't need to get you anything. at that moment in time, I found out what my wife's love language was, right? Because she gave me very good, constructive, honest feedback, right? with a little bit of energy, so I got it. So the fact that gifts are not my thing, it's irrelevant, right? I mean, this is not about finding your love language. This is about finding the love language of your spouse. And then the last inhibitor, sort of the fact that you believe that you are meeting your spouse's love language, right? I mean, you're doing all these things that you think are pleasing, but you're swinging and you're missing because you really haven't really discovered what the love language is. So if you feel like, hey, I'm doing all this work, I'm making all this effort, truly, sincerely making effort, right? Which most of us do. I mean, none of this is about, what's so interesting about the whole love languages is that this isn't due to a lack of effort or a lack of desire in terms of wanting to have a really close bond, a really good, close emotional bond with your spouse. It's just about speaking a language that makes sense to the other, such that you could get optimal appreciation for your time and your effort and your desire for having a good, strong bond with your spouse. So again, I mean, this is no different than really sort of the setup at the beginning, is the search of finding really what makes your spouse tick, right? I mean, that's the key here. The other thing, or sort of the last concept for words of affirmation, is this whole notion of encouraging words, right? In encouraging words, he talks about is a concept, or it's a form of affirmation, right? So it's the kind of thing like, well, to really sort of, a spouse who's maybe lacks a little bit of confidence, or words of affirmation is really their thing, and they're trying to pursue an endeavor or something that they want to try and improve upon in their life, it really helps, it really makes a difference in terms of them achieving, your spouse achieving what it is that they desire to achieve, whatever it might be, if in fact there's encouraging words, if you're supplying the encouragement for that. Now, the one key thing about words of encouragement, what works and what doesn't work, what definitely doesn't work is unsolicited encouragement. Boy, I wish you could, just sort of fill in the blank. And if it's not something that the spouse really wants to do or believes is necessary to do, it could be seen or it could be felt as criticism, right? So, you don't want to get into the words of encouragement because it could, again, be misconstrued unless the spouse is ready for that. But if the spouse shows a notion of, hey, listen, I've been working at this job forever and I'd like to, go out on my own and do whatever it might be, it's that point where it's like, wow, I think you'd be really good at that, or I think you could do that. So you got to wait for the cue before you're sort of instilling the words of encouragement for that to be most effective. So again, we're going to be talking here, like the whole idea here was that we're going to talk for about 30-35 minutes, and then we're going to do some Q&A. So one of the things I just want to do is just sort of, give sort of a quick summary. Certainly for the words of affirmation, it's just as simple as saying something nice. But the broader picture, at least from my perspective, is really understanding this notion about what love is and what love isn't, the difference between infatuation and what real love is, and knowing that to really build a strong bond and strong relationship and strong marriage, it takes work. And the work never stops. The minute you stop working at it is the minute that it starts deteriorating. So stay with it, stay focused, really understand what your spouse's love language is, and work hard at delivering against that love language. So at this point, I kind of want to open it up first for some questions, right? We've got plenty of time for some Q&A. And I know I just did all the talking, but is there anything in general that you'd like to comment on, or that you'd like me to expand upon? Whoops, am I in the wrong?
I'm going to drop the volume of the room, Dave, to raise the mics here, so
okay.
You'll have to speak up.
I need to speak up.
Yeah.
That's hard for me to do. It's not my level.
Open up these mics around the line, and I have to drop the volume of the room.
So, to start with, any thoughts, any general ideas, anything that you'd like to?
over the last couple of years has become important to me because of Psalm 139, and I think it's 1 or 2, and it talks about how God knows me, He sees me. And that's become important to me in general with relationships in my life. And it was like, this retreat that I was at, it like hit me. I've been familiar with that verse, but He sees me. You know, God sees me. When sometimes I think we think, you know, well, He's out there, He sees a lot of people. But it was like He sees me. And that kind of carried over into what I'm finding important in people in my life as what love is that I see you. You know, because sometimes we can say these nice things or give people words of affirmation that might not really hit them because maybe they think it's kind of just something that somebody would say rather than they see me.
No, that's very insightful. Yeah, I mean the whole notion of like, you know, God loving us is grace. I mean, God is knowingly loving us and doing pleasing things to us without any expectation in return, because He sees the essence of who we are, and that's really ultimately the ideal, right? I mean, if you know, if you're able to give to your loved one something that you could give because you do know them and you understand them and you've developed a good relationship with them, I mean, that's pretty powerful. The thing that makes it difficult, you know, again, I think for, you know, most people is that, you know, most people are, and I mean, this is not a criticism, I think this is like human nature. Most people are so focused on what it takes for their needs to be met first before they're meeting the needs of others. And I think that's really, I mean, talking about sort of inhibitors in terms of being really effective at really truly optimally loving your spouse, that's a main inhibitor. God doesn't have that inhibitor. God is, you know, not selfish, you know, and is without ego. So it's a difference, but it's very, very difficult. That was a really good insight.
I know you said you looked at it mostly from a spouse-to-spouse relationship, but in terms of with children, did you find anything for advice around speaking into children and building?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know exactly what our next 4 speakers are going to be talking about. Maybe it will be more specific around children. But quite frankly, like I said right at the very beginning, all of these concepts, it's about spousal relationships, it's about kid relationships, it's about good friend relationships. I think I think these concepts carry over with any of those relationships. And it's very easy. I mean, quite honestly, it's probably a little bit easier, like sort of like unconditionally loving your children just because they're your children, right? I mean, you do it almost really sort of without expectation initially of anything in return, and the kids are in need of that love and that compassion, and they tend to reciprocate, very well. So it actually makes it a little bit easier. But all of these concepts, I think, are pretty consistent with any relationships. But
yeah, to piggyback off that. So like the premise is that, like, I have 2-year-old, 4-year-old, 6-year-old, that they all already have a pre-written love language that they receive on their hearts. Yes? I'm
100% correct. I mean, I've got 4 children, and they're 4 very different children, and they have different needs, they have different desires, and sort of the trick is really understanding what makes each one of them click, and not, again, not falling into the trap of giving what is pleasing to you, but what's pleasing to them, or what makes them tick and what provides energy. But yeah, I mean, this book, I mean, it's a pretty fascinating book again, because it really applies to all relationships. Yeah, I centered it for ease about spousal, but the parent-child thing is all of the stuff thoroughly applies.
Dave, I want to dovetail on that, Andrew, from what you, so last week when we kind of started this off, it's actually easier to determine your young child's love language. Gary Chapman makes this point in the book. As they get older, it gets a little more difficult, and then with your spouse and people are more complex. Your children are much more obvious in their love language because they express it, whether it's physical touch. He shares the story I heard last week that, one child of his would call every day to get home from work and just give me a hug, Daddy, and hold on. And then the other one would say, hey, come in my room and play with me. And that was quality time. Sure. Want to spend time with them. So you see it emerge with a young child a little more, clearly than when they get older. In the teen years and stuff, it's much more difficult. When I first discovered this book in the 90s, our children were younger, so we were kind of able to jump, but still, it's not easy. And when I shared last week with Josh, who's 20 years old, Julie and I talked about it. We can't quite pin down exactly what his is, so it's not always that clear. So,
if you've entirely missed your child's love language and they're an adult now, where would be a good place to start? If their love language is words of affirmation and you've missed that.
It's a good question. It's a really good question, and it's like never too late. In fact, it's, if you potentially think that you missed it when they were younger, start now. It will click. It will immediately click. And and that's sort of the whole notion of kind of one of the things that really made sense to me about sort of this whole topic and this whole series is that you should never stop doing it, right? And once you find it, you should never say, if you miss, it doesn't mean you miss a little bit, you miss it forever. Jump on right now. It's never too late. And in fact, much of the people that Chapman talks to are people that have been missing the love language all the way up until the point that they were having conversations. And as he was giving advice and they were taking the advice from that point forward, it's amazing the transformation that happens in marriages and relationships by doing it, even though it's almost like the past is sort of forgotten. It's all about, what's coming up. So jump on right now.
In terms of figuring out what that is, would it be safe to say you could observe what that person, how they show love, and then start just showing that to them? Because typically we show the love language we like to receive.
Yeah, so I sort of snuck it in. I probably didn't emphasize that enough. It's like I talked about creating lists and communications. But really, it's being a true observant of the other. And it's difficult to be a true observant, again, because you've got all the stuff that's sort of clouding, that you're sort of trapped in terms of like, hey, how do I please myself? That you can't sort of wipe that away to truly objectively look and observe and understand without worrying about like your needs not being met at that very moment in time. Very, very difficult for most people. But observation is the real key. Objective observation, right? Not observation like, okay, you're trying to sort of fit that person into how you think they should be loved, right? And that's a real common mistake. But really understanding, where they lie, what clicks with them versus not. So yes.
I just kind of want to make two encouraging comments because I think we all, anybody who's in here, as a parent, as a spouse, I think we all have some guilt of, oh shoot. Two things I would say to that. One, because we are all adults in here and now you have an adult, I want to empower you. I do think it is our responsibility to state to our spouse what our love language is. I want to be careful that I think, and I'm going to kind of say it nicely, but I think we do it a little arse backwards, where we assume the other person should figure that out. And I empower you, no, I don't want him to spend time and energy trying to figure out, I want him to be observant, I want him to watch me, I want all these things, but I do think it's my job to express that and say that. So one is opening that conversation, if he is an adult now, of, I'm not sure I got this right, and just open that door. He will feel hurt. Two, I think as parents, we have a bad tendency of focusing on what we didn't do right, especially as I'm laying in bed at night. And so I try to, every night before bed, what are 3 things I did right that day? Obviously, the fact that you have a relationship, there's so much you did right. Focus on the times you did say those things and you did. Open that conversation with him. I don't feel like I gave this to you. He might say, yes, you did. Here was when. This was how. So opening that conversation, nothing could go wrong there. That's it.
The question that me and my wife were talking about was, how do love languages change over time through whether that be death, life, impacts, things like that, to be able to say it was this, but through this event or through this change or stuff like that, as people grow, as people develop, do their love languages change over time based off of external impacts?
Yeah, I mean, again, so it's a great question. I mean, and all I could do is sort of share just my own feelings about it. I mean, that was sort of difficult thing. I mean, we're sort of doing this talk, sort of this clinical, psychological kind of talk, and I mean, I've got no training in this, right? I crunch numbers, right? But I mean, but having said that, I mean, we're all very experienced in relationships. I mean, we all have a lifelong experience in just relationships and interactions and social, whatnot. On the question of can it change? I mean, we talked a little bit about this last week, and I actually thought about that a little bit on my own. And my instincts are sort of. I think it's sort of changed, right? I mean, I think you've got sort of an inherent nature, an inherent foundation of who you are and really what makes you tick. And it's the whole thing about, I haven't seen this person in 10 years and they haven't changed one bit at all, right? You know what I mean? And so there's some truth to that. But yeah, I mean, I think but having said that, I mean, I think there are things that maybe sort of shift the intensity of your particular love language. I would say yes. I think it does. It can shift a little bit. But I think you're kind of always who you are. It's just my mind.
Okay, can I add on to that? Mickey and Greg Lewis, we talked about this last week afterwards, because I raised the question during my presentation last week. So I always, whenever there's a question, I try to go do homework, and I found a good YouTube video from Gary Chapman. He does address this. And this kind of goes back as a reminder for everyone too. If you go to last week's presentation, you'll find the profile quiz, or you can just Google Gary Chapman 5 Love Languages profile quiz test, whatever it is, assessment. You can take that at any time. When you take that, if you jump out at something that is clearly a higher number than the other 4, mine is always clearly physical touch. I mean, my numbers are just higher there. That has always been consistently. But if you're more even across the board, you can kind of morph in and out through the 5 love languages a little bit. So I really think the answer to that, from what Gary Chapman said in the YouTube video I watched this week and looking at the profile assessment again, is if you take that profile assessment and you're really, really strong, a much higher number with a close second, you'll be in that camp pretty much your whole life. It's how you're wired. It's how God wired you.
So I was right. I was right. That was the affirmation. I was just saying I was right.
I'll piggyback. Let's piggyback. So yeah, Vicky and I were we took the love languages when we before we got married about 8 years ago, and her language has shifted over time. So I was a hotel manager for 10 years. I was living at the hotel pretty much a lot, so she was lacking quality time, which was her love language. During the pandemic, I changed careers. Now I'm Monday through Friday, home on weekends. Probably gets too much quality time. Now she's more active service oriented, since I'm there to help out more and get her to kids. So I think it can change based on your circumstances in your marriage and career, a lot of that plays.
The word that comes to mind for me is it evolves, based off of where you're at in life, how other things are being met or not.
Right. What about sort of the struggle sort of following up on that is that the spouse wanting the other spouse to love language to change. That could be a problem. Say, I don't like that one. I don't want that. Right? So there could be a little bit of that focus. It ain't going to change. This is what. Good. Any other thoughts?
to us something on a lighter note, something I heard here.
This hasn't been light enough. I've tried as hard as I can.
You did a great job, Dave. Talking about statistics reminded me of it. I heard that if you make it 7 years in a marriage, you're about a 50% chance to make it to long haul. If you make it to 11 years, you're about 80% chance of making it to long haul. And then the third thing was 46% of the statistics are made up.
3 out of every 4 people make up 75%. Any lighter? Good. Anything else, Don?
No, just one thing, I was just reading John chapter 12, and the fact that, we're given the command to love one another. So Christians in the room, and just the fact that you're here and committed, this is all about trial and error. This entire book is about learning this. And Jesus gave us the command to love one another. And greater love is no man than this lays down his life for another. We do this for one another. We do this for our spouses, for our children, for our family. So this is really just as simple as trying the 5 love languages. Trying them out because you care about your loved ones, and if your marriage is strained, if they're you're just not connecting, this is a great way to try and figure some things out. And Julie and I years ago walked through these. I said, in this Christian Men's Ministry, there are things that I never even thought about. And going through this and just trying to apply these love languages, you will learn things. You'll discover things. And in the midst of that, I said it last week, just the fact that you're trying will speak volumes, right?
Yeah. And I think the thing to me that is so great about the love languages in the book, we did many talks last year, and they were very theological in nature. And those are challenging, right? They're challenging to study, they're challenging to understand, they're challenging to deliver, and challenging to receive. Actually, for me, this was, out of the 7 talks I did last year, this was the most difficult for me. It's not really sort of 100% of my comfort zone, but what I did note, in reading this book and kind of going through it, it's so profound, it's so simple, right? It's just got an amazing contrast between being so insightful and so simple, so easy to do. The most challenging thing is just doing it, recognizing that, again, like the point that I was making earlier, it's like, who does this topic apply to? Don't be misconstrued to thinking that this topic only applies to people who have problems with their marriage. Because I would say, yes, it does, which means it applies probably problems or issues or challenges with their marriage. It applies to all of us. And the whole notion of that for something good for your marriage to work and work not only today, tomorrow, the next day, but you got to work it every single day. And the simplicity of this, I think, makes it very viable to work this every day. This isn't complicated stuff. You just have to work at it. So there. I do have an announcement because you asked me to. Well, no, you told me to. I think I got all the things you asked me to leave. So next week, Leanne will be talking. And she's got gifts, and she's going to be bringing a gift. We're making a cake, so I'm there. Is
that true?
So Dave will be in the front row? Yes. I'm bringing a gift for everybody.
That'll get everyone back. Dave, I'm going to put you on the spot before you close with prayer.
Yeah.
You are words of affirmation.
How'd you know?
And it's why you picked this talk. So people who don't speak words of affirmation, right? Once again, our kids need encouraging words all the time. Their spouse needs it. So we speak all 5 of these love languages, but if it's not your natural one, you didn't grow up in a household where that took place, and it's your love language, what do you say to the people who don't naturally speak that language?
Yeah, so It's like sort of not like sort of a one sentence thing. I mean, it's kind of like it sort of embedded a lot of that stuff like when I was talking, which is the fact that I know you just got to sort of keep sort of sharing constructively that, hey, so, say something nice to me, and if it sort of feels like it's like, wow, that's kind of petty, like, oh, you always gotta need the pat on the back or whatever. The answer is yes. I mean, it's as truthful as that. I don't, I think so here's sort of the trick. I mean, it's a great question. Again, it's sort of like the point that I just made in terms of trying to change your spouse's love language, right? I mean, you got to start with accepting the fact that the two languages are different, and not sort of say, hey, wanting that person or wanting to make that person to be like who you are. That's not what you're really trying to do at all. But you just have to find sort of constructive ways to just remind the other, your spouse, of this makes me feel good, this doesn't make me feel good. And again, I mean, the whole purpose of like this whole study is that both people have to be somewhat committed towards trying to find something that's knowing and pleasing to the other, in spite of the fact that it might not be, what you're giving to them might not be pleasing to yourself. And just the understanding that that's what the definition of love is. It's giving something that's knowing and pleasing, regardless if it's pleasing to you, and doing it without any expectation of getting anything in return. So I don't know that it's specific to words of affirmation. I think that advice is whatever the difference in your love language is versus what your spouse's love language is.
Last week, just before you close the prayer, Dave, is if you're not naturally speaking a love language, it's baby steps. So this was the thing that the dad who I gave the illustration last week, the dad who didn't speak physical touch, and the son was physical touch. And Gary Chapman gave him the homework assignment of a little punch on the arm when he walked by his son, and then a pat on the back. So words of affirmation is not, just figure it may be so foreign to you, but start with, oh, that looks really nice on you, and then run out of the room, okay? And so just...
I think the biggest testament to loving one another is truly giving something that is not pleasing to you. The fact that you could possibly give something that has no pleasurable effect to you other than knowing that you've just pleased your spouse, and then again, expecting nothing in return, there couldn't be any better expression of love, i.e. the whole notion of grace. I think those two things really go hand in hand, and I think that's really one of the big punchlines. It's, again, where I started, really understanding what the true definition of love. God demonstrates this every single day, and I think that's ultimately what this study is asking us to demonstrate in our spouses, an element of grace. It's a not bad way to spend. So yeah,
close up.
Yeah, just on the last minute. Okay. Dear Lord, thank you for bringing us all together here today to study this very simple but profound topic. We felt your presence here today, and we thank you for being with us. And we hope that these words will have meaning, and we'll be able to take the right action to continue to act upon it and continue to enhance, improve, and optimize the relationships that we have with our loved ones. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Good job.
Can I put it on?